Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to yet another day in eyeshadow palette week, where every single day for 7 days straight I am posting some sort of palette themed content. And today we are going to be reflecting on all of my 2021 palette purchases. Last week I posted a video about, maybe it was Sunday even, about my reflecting on my 2021 Sephora purchases, and I had mentioned in that video that I want to do sort of like a reflection series on my channel. Not something that I'll be updating every single week, but something every so often where I'm reflecting back on something. I do want to compare my 2019 low buy to my 2021 low buy. That's another idea that I have. I'm getting rambly and way off track, but today I have all of the eyeshadow palettes. I'm gonna pull it on over. I had a casualty earlier today. I was pulling my makeup cart over to me and one of my palettes dropped and we lost a shade today. Thankfully only one shade. So I do want to preface this video by saying I tried to do as much digging and research as I could to figure out that I truly purchased all of these in 2021, but there's a few where there's a gray area. I am hopeful that I'm not missing any of the eyeshadow palettes either that I purchased in 2021, but my research got a little bit fuzzy for this video. So bear with me if there's a couple of outlying things where you're like, Steph, did you really get that in 2021? Or if you're like, wait, what about that other palette? I do have my windows open as well, so I apologize if it is noisy, but fall weather in Minnesota, when it's nice and you can have your windows open, you take that, because winter weather is a-coming. So by my best estimate, I did bring 56 eyeshadow palettes into my collection last year. I do have a year-end palette ranking video, but some of the palettes that I ranked in that video, I purchased towards the end of 2020 and 2021. Those 2 years I found really bleed together hard. But I have 56 palettes to reflect on with you guys today. I did not go back and watch how I ranked these palettes. I'm not going to be ranking the palettes for you today. We're going to be going month by month, and I'm going to show you each palette that I brought in each month and kind of just give you my feelings, thoughts, stream of consciousness about each palette as we go along. Just as a fun way to chit chat about palettes. So if you are interested, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project panning content, palette themed content, or just chit chatting about makeup, I'd love if you'd consider subscribing before moving on. Side note, if you like bookish content, I do now have a book channel, which will also be down below in case you are interested in subscribing to that. But other than that, let's jump into the video. Okay, I do want to start, I'm going to go month by month like I said, and again, month by month gets even more hairy on how accurate I am about when these palettes came into my life. But I do want to start with these 16 eyeshadow palettes that I have since Decluttered that came into my collection last year. I gave myself a goal this year of only purchasing 3 palettes per month, or only bringing in a total of 36 eyeshadow palettes, based on the fact that I brought way too many palettes into my collection last year and just got extremely overwhelmed. I will leave my most recent palette declutter down below, but out of the 56 palettes that I purchased or brought into my collection in 2021, I've already decluttered 16 of them, which is almost 30%. It's 28.5, teetering on 29%, which is just absolutely insane to me. So I'm glad that I gave myself sort of a palette limit this year, if you will, and I've actually stuck to that. And I'm actually under, I think I have brought in 21 or 22 and I can bring in 36. So I'm very confident I will reach my goal of not bringing any more than 36 palettes into my collection this year. But let's quickly chit chat about the 16 eyeshadow palettes that I purchased last year that have since been decluttered. And we can start with the BH Cosmetics Lunar New Year palette. I knew going into 2021 that my palette videos were some of my most watched, and palettes are something palettes are a part of my makeup routine I love, and they're also my favorite makeup product to chat about. So going into 2021, I knew I wanted to have more of a palette themed focus on my channel, meaning I went absolutely buck wild and purchased so many palettes towards the end of 2020, going into 2021, thinking I was going to use these palettes for all these different content ideas, etc., and used my YouTube channel as a crutch, or as an excuse to just bring in all of the eyeshadow palettes. So the BH Cosmetics Lunar New Year palette sort of fell into like this trap, if you will, or fell into this, I fell into the trap, but this was one of those purchases while in that trap. And I just like did not need this palette, and I'm like kicking myself because there's so many other palettes that I really was interested in from BH. For example, like the Sweet Shop ice cream palettes. Like, why did I not purchase a couple of those as opposed to this Lunar New Year palette that like was obviously going to be limited edition and I just didn't need. So disappointed in myself for that. And then there are two palettes that were like super like purple tone palettes, one of them being the Aether Beauty Amartine, maybe it was the Amethyst palette, can't remember it. And then it's like the Amartine Quad, I believe it's the Amethyst. It's a larger palette. I do really enjoy the Aether Beauty eyeshadow formula, but I have found that while I like purple shadows and I like mauves and purple looks, it's not something I'm reaching for on a day-to-day basis, especially if I'm thinking about like work wear, if you will. I don't want to say like work appropriate because everybody's workplace is going to be different, and what might work for you in the workplace might not work for someone else. But in terms of like thinking about eyeshadow that I would wear to work, purples just really weren't something that I would be wearing that often. So I found specifically with the Melt She's in Parties as well as the Aether Beauty Amethyst palette, because these were like deeper palettes as well, I just was not reaching for them really at all. So I did decide to declutter both of those in my most recent declutter, not because of the quality, but really just because I was not getting use out of these. And I think if I really took a step back and thought about like day-to-day use as opposed to YouTube, I would not have purchased either of these palettes. Maybe I would have purchased one, but probably not both, especially considering both of these are higher end. They cost over $50 a piece. So I did declutter both of those. Also the Rare Beauty, I'm forgetting the name, I'll obviously post a picture on the screen. I was super excited for this palette and I just did not find that the quality worked for me. There was one shade in particular that was this really beautiful duochrome, but I found that the palette overall just was not worth keeping around just for like that duochrome. I also felt like the packaging of the Rare Beauty eyeshadow palette felt incredibly cheap, which normally like I wouldn't care about, but I just wanted to note that. And ultimately I reached for this palette like somewhere between 3 and 5 times before deciding like it just wasn't for me and I was going to declutter it. The ColourPop Zodiac or Astrology sign quads released last year, and I ended up purchasing 6 out of the 12, and then I decluttered 4 out of those 6 my last eyeshadow palette declutter. Or no, sorry, I decluttered 3 out of the 4. I do like the ColourPop quads, but the 3 that I decluttered, I felt like I felt like there were overlapping shades within my collection, and I preferred, I don't know, I guess I would say like I felt like the quality in the ColourPop Astrology palettes specifically was lacking here and there. Like there were some shades I was really excited about, like I thought they were going to be a really beautiful foiled or metallic shade on the lids, and then they were just like powdery and chalky, and I just was not that impressed. There were 3 that I kept around that I really liked. I believe it was the Capricorn, Taurus, and Pisces, but ultimately I did end up decluttering 3 out of the 6, so we were 50 for 50%. Do you get what I'm saying? I hope so. Okay, I'm putting this with an asterisk because I cannot find proof that I purchased this palette. But I swear to you, I purchased one of the Huda Beauty chocolate palettes. Like I swear I purchased one during the Sephora VIB sale last year. But if I did, I either returned or decluttered it, and it's not in my like Sephora history, but I could swear to you that I owned one of the Huda chocolate palettes, because I remember I wanted to purchase all 3, and then I felt like I talked myself out of 2 out of the 3, but still purchased one of them. And I swear I can like envision myself using the chocolate palette and being like disappointed in the quality, but I cannot find me purchasing it anywhere. So is it like in my dreams that I owned this palette? I will say I did not go back and watch my full Sephora VIB playlist from that time, but it's not like in my Sephora purchases list. So I'm like, is it like the Milk Cosmetics blush where I thought it was in my cart but then I didn't purchase it? I really don't know, but I'm fairly convinced I own that and either returned or decluttered it. I believe, I want to say it was like the deepest of the chocolate brown palettes. Like, why can I not remember this? A palette that I am certain that I purchased during the Sephora VIB sale that was a quick declutter for me was the Natasha Denona Circo Loco palette. I shouldn't have purchased this. I just got caught up in the hype of the Sephora VIB sale, being able to get it on sale, thinking it was such a fun, colorful palette. But again, in terms of thinking through like how often do I actually wear color, at that time I was like still kind of dabbling in color. I've definitely fallen off the colorful wagon lately, and I feel like I've been doing a lot more just neutral looks. But I also felt like the quality specifically within that eyeshadow palette just was not there for me. I got a ton of creasing in like my actual crease. Like, it was like I had taken a picture and put it in one of my videos, but literally like where like my lid meets my upper eye, if you will, like literally in the crease, even using an eyeshadow primer, it would disappear. Like, I would close my eyes and there'd be this section where there was literally just no eyeshadow. So I ended up decluttering that. Also, the Pat McGrath quad, I want to say, I'm forgetting the name. It was like released around Valentine's Day. The Pat McGrath quads, I found like I really should just stop buying them. Honestly, I should just stop buying all Pat McGrath palettes. But I purchased this because I had a lot of other Pat McGrath quads and I felt like I needed to round out my collection. And really there was just nothing special about this quad at all. There was one shade in particular that I really liked. You'll find in my last palette declutter, I struggled to declutter this palette based on literally one shade, but I still never reached into that quad. So I did ultimately end up decluttering it, but wish I never even purchased that. The Artist Couture Supreme Nudes, like the mini, I want to say he called it like the Quickie. There was like Quickie in the name, or like Snack, but it was a smaller Supreme Nudes palette. And I will say, like, if I didn't own Supreme Nudes, like the larger palette, I probably would have kept this palette, but I didn't realize like 4 of the shades were not new shades, so only half of the palette were shades that I didn't already own in my collection. And I did feel like the quality in this palette was less than the larger Artist Couture palettes. I love my Supreme Nudes as well as my Supreme Bronze. Supreme Mauves is good. It's not like the absolute best palette, but I just felt like the Quickie palette, like the quality just wasn't there, and it was like a neutral brown palette. For work appropriate, or for like your everyday average makeup consumer who's just doing like a neutral or a warm brown look, I do feel like this would be a great palette, especially for travel as well. Thinner, sleek packaging, but ultimately I own the palette. Like, I owned half the palette already, so I kept my Supreme Nudes, decluttered the Quickie palette. The Nabla Analog palette, not Analog, the blue one. What did they call that one? I'll post a picture right here. So I got the Trend Mood box that it was like the Nabla takeover, and it came with the, I think it was the Analog, and then I'm forgetting what the blue one was called. And I decided to declutter the blue one, even though I think if you like blue eyeshadow, like this would be like the perfect palette for you. I absolutely love Nabla Cosmetics. You guys know that if you're a longtime subscriber. I'm literally obsessed with Nabla and will rave about them any chance I can get. Quality was great. I just am not reaching for blue eyeshadow really ever. Like, occasionally I'll dabble in it, but it's usually like I'm still doing a neutral look and then I'll just pop blue into the look in some way. So I just wasn't getting use out of this palette and ultimately decided to declutter it. I do think if you love blue eyeshadow, you would likely really love this palette, but it just was not for me. And then finally, the final 2 palettes that have been decluttered, I believe in 2021, but it's possible I purchased right at the tail end of 2020. And it is the Juvia's Place, the Mauves palette and the Pinks palette. I am just not someone who loves the quality of Juvia's Place. Like, I just don't think it's that great. And I feel like maybe I am alone in my opinions on that, because I know people just absolutely love the Juvia's formula, but I've never been all that impressed with it. And I decluttered both of these during my most recent declutter. I thought about keeping the Pinks palette because I do find that those shades are very unique to my collection, but I just never am doing pink eyeshadow. Like, pinks are just not my thing, and then especially like super vibrant pinks. Like, I would maybe reach for that palette like 2, maybe 3 times a year, and it just was not worth keeping around for me. So I did ultimately declutter both of those. So those were all of my declutters. Now let me try and get into these palettes like month by month. And again, it's a little hairy, it's a little dicey. I'm not 100% certain I'm giving the most accurate information on when exactly these palettes came into my life, but we'll reflect on all of the palettes regardless. So in January, the 2 palettes still in my collection that haven't been decluttered that I believe came into my life in January, I have the Juvia's Place, the Nomad palette, and I purchased this alongside the Pinks palette and the Mauves palette. I think I placed an order on Juvia's Place, and this is why I'm not sure if it was 2020 or 2021. It may have been an end of the year 2020 purchase, because I feel like I got them on like major sale. But I did purchase the Nomad palette, and I will say again, I don't think the quality is like the best eyeshadow quality on the market, but I do really love this shade right here. It's this really, really beautiful like golden taupey green shade, so metallic and so beautiful on the eyes. That shade is really, really smooth as well. And then you just have these really fun grungier fall shades. I think because I brought this into my collection like in the winter time going opposite fall, I didn't get a ton of use out of it, and then last fall I barely wore makeup, so this really hasn't had like a good chance within my collection, and I am determined to get a ton more use out of it this fall time. So the time frame we're in right now, but I did purchase this last year. I do have a pan on it. I believe I used this either as a liner or a brow shade last year and was able to hit pan. I don't foresee myself, like, unless this goes, even if this went terribly this fall and I didn't really like the performance or wasn't getting a ton of great looks out of the rest of the shades, I might still keep this around specifically for this shade because I love it so much. But I do think the color story is really fun in that it's a little bit unique and grungy in my collection. So I brought that in. And then I also brought in the Nomad Cosmetics Iceland Fire and Ice palette. I will say I'm not super impressed with the quality of this palette. I have heard that the quality of Nomad shadows have gotten better with each launch and each release. I was really interested in just trying more indie brands last year, which is why I kind of just like jumped at the chance to purchase a palette from Nomad, even though I knew the color story didn't necessarily speak to my everyday makeup tastes, being that there's quite a few blues. The reason this palette was so disappointing to me is because the shimmer or metallic shades, I just don't feel like have a good lasting power or lasting time on the eyes. And the mattes were fine, but I just felt like overall the quality was lacking. There are so many Nomad palettes that have released since now that the color story speaks to me so much more, and I am interested in trying another palette from Nomad. So if you have a palette recommendation from them, like a favorite, do let me know in the comments. I have kept this palette around because I want to still have the formula in my collection. It's my only palette from Nomad, and I do like supporting indie brands, and if I can do like comparisons or things like that in the future on my channel, I want to at least have one palette from Nomad Cosmetics. So I'll continue to keep this around at the bare minimum, at least until I purchase another palette from them. I love the whole aesthetic of the brand in that they release palettes about different places throughout the world, and I just think like the brand overall, like, I really enjoy. So the palette quality, not as much. Okay, and then I cannot for the life of me remember when the Club Nebula palette released from Kaleidos and Angie. It may have not been even close to like January, February, and maybe I'm thinking it was January, February because her palette with Odin's Eye released around January of this year. But I'm just going to include this right now. So I have the Club Nebula palette, obviously in collaboration with Angie, and I absolutely adore this palette. I'm so happy to have this in my collection. I love the Kaleidos formula. Like, I feel like their quality of eyeshadow is just top notch. I love their packaging, the time that they take to put into the making like the packaging and the names of shades and the description just like fit the overall aesthetic of the brand. I just like truly value that from Kaleidos. So I'm very happy to have this in my collection. There's definitely some shades that intimidate me in this palette, but I've created so many fun looks with this one. I love all of the shimmers, and this Astro shade is absolutely beautiful. This is very similar to one of the shades in the Nabla, like the blue palette, and I almost kept the blue palette for that shade, but this one was so similar. I was like, oh, I'm good just having this palette. This bottom row, I love creating like just really beautiful, like warm coral looks with, and I just think that Angie did such a good job with this one. I'm so happy to have this in my collection. All right, let's move on to February. In February, the Urban Decay Wild West palette launched, and I was so freaking excited about this. Mine did come with the one of the shades I was most excited for, Cowboy Rick, came shattered, but I just kind of like repressed it in there. And honestly, it's just like not a shade realistically I reach for that often anyway, so it wasn't a big deal. I do now have a pan in this palette in the shade Standoff, which is just a lid setting shade, but this palette, how do I want to like start? Like, I was so excited for this palette, but it's not like an absolute favorite in my collection. But out of many of the Urban Decay Naked palettes that I've tried, the quality in this one is some of the best. I just feel like it's just kind of like an an everyday, like another just like neutral palette with pops of blue. But I also knew that going into purchasing this palette, and I've reached for this one so much this year, so I feel like it's like one of those that's like boring but comfortable, if you will. Like, it's like I really don't have any complaints, but I also feel like it's nothing like super special to my collection, if that makes sense. But I've reached for that one a ton, and that one's not going anywhere anytime soon. All right, and then also in February, or like potentially end of January, I purchased the Natasha Denona Love eyeshadow palette, and then the like Mini Love collection launched, and with that I got the Mini Love eyeshadow palette. I do have a pan in the Mini Love. I did a whole dedicated review to the Mini Love collection. That's so old, but I'll leave that linked below. The palette is okay in my opinion. The two matte shades are actually a lot deeper than I expected. Even this shade right here goes a lot deeper. I really like the mauve shade, this shade, and then I absolutely love this shade right here with the pan in it. It's one of my favorite inner corner highlights throughout my entire collection, because it's like a champagne pop, but has like almost just like the slightest hint of like pinky purple to it, and it just like, it really just like amps up any look. I love this palette so much, specifically for that inner corner highlight shade the most. And then I finally purchased the Mini Love palette last year, or not Mini Love, the Midi Love palette. This is something that I had been eyeing since this released, but finally decided to purchase it. And I will say I haven't gotten the absolute most use out of this, nor do I believe it is like an absolute favorite or staple in my collection, but the quality is good and I'm not going to declutter it. It's just that I found that like specifically these types of purples, and like obviously the majority of the palette is pink, those are not the shades I'm wearing on an everyday basis when it comes to my eyeshadow palette looks. If I'm filming and I want to do a purple look for the day or a pink look for the day, maybe, yeah, sure, but like day to day I'm reaching for more like neutrals and browns. So it's just not a palette that gets a ton of use from me. I still think it's beautiful. I love some of the shimmer shades in here. I think they're very special and very unique to my collection, but overall, did I absolutely need that? Like, would I be upset if this palette like went missing? Only because I spent money on it, not because I would like actually miss the shades, if that makes sense. All right, I have 5 palettes for March, and I'm again like questioning the timing on some of these just a little bit, but I have the Too Faced Born This Way Natural Nudes palette. I had been thinking about this palette for quite some time and finally purchased it on the Ulta website. I love this palette. It's great for if you truly think about like day-to-day like travel and you just use like neutral shades. This would be great for that. Or if you think about like typical office appropriate looks, like you can get that from this palette. I do have a pan in here. It's in the lid setting shade, but I reached for this palette so much last year, and that got a ton of use, so that was not a waste of a purchase. Odin's Eye is one of my absolute favorite indie brands, so I was super excited about the Norns palette last year, and I reached for this quite a bit last year, but I also reached for this quite a bit this year as well. I still am hopeful before the end of the year I can hit pan in this shade up here, which is Pink Chameleon. This is such a unique palette to my collection. They have such a beautiful shimmer metallic foiled formula, and I just love this palette so much, even though this is definitely outside of my comfort zone in that it's a little bit deeper. And just looking at this, like, I'm like, okay, I don't necessarily know I can create a full look with me and my like makeup abilities using just this palette, but using this as a companion palette with other palettes, it's great, and I love it so much. And when I placed that order, I decided to also pick up one of the mini 6-pan eyeshadow palettes as well. This is the Verdandi palette. This is what this one looks like. It's a really easy palette to just do like really quick looks. I love both of the shades in the center, but I also really appreciate having these two like warmer orange and red in my collection, as well as this like more browny mauve and then this like brown green shade. Actually, I've gotten more use out of this palette than I expected to, so I'm not mad about that. A palette that's barely gotten any use, and I just probably shouldn't have purchased this, but it is the Oma Beauty Coming to America palette. And I purchased this because I wanted to test out the Oma Beauty eyeshadow formula, and I thought it would be like, I love my Sugar Pill Bite Size palette, and this kind of reminded me of that. 9-pan palette, super colorful. But when I purchased this last year, I was still like, in 2020 I feel like I did a nice job of playing around with color, and so March of 2021 I felt like I was still experimenting with color, or would get a ton of use out of colorful palettes, and I just really did not. So I've barely reached for this. I really need to. Like, this green shade I haven't used, and it looks so beautiful. Also, I need to use that. That'll be the goal. Before the end of the year, use that a decent amount of times. One of my favorite palettes of last year came into my collection in March, and that is the ColourPop Limoncello palette. I remember when this launched, I was like, okay, I get that this isn't super unique to like anyone's collection, but something about this just really spoke to me. And so I picked this up. Once I finished testing this, I could not stop using it. I was bringing so many eyeshadow palettes into my collection last year that like as things were coming in, I needed to like continue to test and test. But even after finishing testing this, it wasn't like on to the next. It was like, I want to continue to use this. I brought this traveling with me last year, and it's just such a versatile palette. You got a really good mix of warm browns, but I absolutely love the variety of shimmers as well. I love the green in here because you can add a pop of color, you can add a pop of blue. You have this beautiful like brighter yellow shimmer too, so you can do like a yellow look, which is just super fun. And overall, the Limoncello is still a favorite in my collection. I am so freaking happy that I purchased this. I believe I purchased both of these January 2021. This is like one of the purchases I'm like, this gets a little fuzzy, is this right? But I have the ColourPop Making Mauves, which I believe I purchased off Kelly Gooch's recommendation, and I was super excited about. I haven't reached for this one a ton, but I really need to this fall because this truly looks beautiful for everyday mauve tone looks. So I'm excited about this one. I'm still happy to have that in my collection. And then also the ColourPop Wild Child palette was truly a winner in my opinion from last year. I like that it's deeper than a lot of ColourPop palettes, and you can really just do like such a smoldering, like smoky warm brown eye, which is one of my favorite looks ever. So love this one from ColourPop as well. Okay, April, I believe this might be the only palette from April. The circle, like there's some declutters from April, but the one I purchased in April that's still in my collection is the Melt Mary Jane. This is not an eyeshadow palette that I would recommend to everybody, but if you're willing to take extra time when doing your eyeshadow, I think you'll enjoy this one. There are some shades, for example, Sweet Lucy right here, which it looks like has since cracked and almost has a pan in Sweet Lucy. I do have a pan here. I believe I used this again as a liner or an eyebrow shade last year, but Sweet Lucy has a ton of fallout. So does Mary Jane actually. Every time I've used this palette, I have a lot of fallout. There's a lot of cleanup, but I love the looks that I get. They're definitely deeper, smokier, more intense, but if that's something that you're after, I think you will enjoy this palette. I don't necessarily think it'll become a favorite just because it truly, there's so much fallout. It's very messy. It does take a lot of extra effort, but I'm not mad to have that in my collection. Could I have done without it? Yes. Am I gonna declutter it? No. Okay, we have May next. I have 3 eyeshadow palettes, I believe, that I purchased in May. Up first, I have the BH Cosmetics 90s Dance Remix palette. I didn't need this, but it was on the Ulta website. Obviously, BH Cosmetics is more affordable, and I just thought this was really fun. Again, kind of thinking like maybe I'm still gonna experiment with color and this would be a fun option. I loved the lime greens, so I decided to purchase this, and I've actually gotten a decent amount of use on this and should pull this back out. It's very user-friendly in that you have neutrals up here, but then it like pairs the colors together, so it just like works really well for me in my mind, because sometimes when you have a really colorful palette and it's like the colors are kind of everywhere, it's hard for me to like piece together a look in my mind. This just makes it very easy. The quality in this is really good. I don't know how BH Cosmetics does it, but I am happy about that one. A palette, where'd it go? I just had it. One of my favorite palettes that I have found last year, and this kickstarted my obsession with NARS Cosmetics. It is the NARS Summer Solstice palette. This is the first ever palette that I purchased from NARS, even though I felt like I always like side-eyed the NARS palettes when I was in store. I purchased this spur of the moment on a whim. It wasn't like this release and I was like, yes, have to have it. It was just like I was in Sephora, walked by this, and I was like, that looks pretty and I feel like spending money today. And I purchased this, and I used this so much last summer. This was like my go-to. The like shimmers in here are more like lid toppers, and that was just like kind of what I was going for last year. So easy to use, even just like tapping your finger in and rubbing it on your eye, it just looked like you had your makeup professionally done. So pretty. I did not reach for this enough this past summer, and I'm disappointed in myself because truly this is like one of my absolute favorite palettes in my collection. So glad that I purchased that one last year. And then the other palette that came into my collection or my life last May was the Natasha Denona Zendo palette. This released in May. I was so excited for it when I saw it teased. I knew I was going to purchase it on launch day. I did, and I haven't reached for this. If I've reached for this year, I don't remember it. Like, this just was not really it for me. The quality was lacking in some of the shades. Like, there's some shades that perform just fine. Like, they're great, they're fine. But then there's others that were like, ooh, like that just like really doesn't work. So overall, I just like was not as impressed with this palette for like the excitement that I felt for it, which was a bummer. But I mean, I'm not going to declutter it. I still get use out of it. There's plenty of shades that like are perfect for day-to-day wear. Unfortunately, it was more like the blue-green shades just like didn't work for me, but it is what it is. Okay, I'm not sure when the ColourPop quads launched last year, and actually my Taurus one is still sitting in my bathroom, but I'm just going to talk about them now around like the June time. As I mentioned when I was talking about the declutters, I do still have the Capricorn, the Pisces, and the Taurus. The quality was hit or miss on these, but I do find like even with this one, like this isn't like the most exciting quad in my collection, but I love this shade right here. The quality of the mattes is really good, and like I wasn't expecting a ton from these shimmers, but these are beautiful. I love my Taurus quad. I think the quality is really nice in those. The ColourPop quads are really, like the packaging is really nice and sturdy. I just wasn't super impressed by the other three that I decided to declutter, but I'm happy to have three that worked for me and are still in my collection. And then in June, I also purchased the Artist Couture Supreme Bronze, which is another favorite in my collection. These Artist Couture palettes are just some of my favorite. They always catch my attention when he launches a new one. The mauves this year was not as good as the nudes or the bronze, but I still am happy to have that in my collection. The packaging is some of my favorite eyeshadow packaging ever. It's just super, super sleek. I do find that the Artist Couture formula, like the matte specifically, are a little bit more powdery, so if that's something that bothers you, it's definitely something to note. But the metallics and the foiled shimmer shades within the Artist Couture palettes are so smooth on the eyes. They remind me of the Persona Identity one specifically that I love so much, and this is just such a beautiful color story if you're looking for like a warm smoldering bronze look, and I loved this one. And then I also purchased another Pat quad last year that I definitely did not need to purchase, but I kept this one around because I do really enjoy these two shades right here. This is the Voyeuristic Vixen quad. There are a handful of Pat McGrath quads that I've kept around, but overall I just feel like her quads in general are really not for me. You can buy indie shadows and just like pick your shades, but I do like, that's a really fun shade. Like, it's a little bit flaky, but on the eyes, it's stunning. It's like a wet, glossy, beautiful look. So I'm not mad to have that, but this is another one. This is one where if I could declutter it and get my money back, I would. Do you know what I mean? I'm also not 100% sure when these two ColourPop palettes came into my life, but I believe it was around June or July. So I have the Lush Life palette, which I actually am so happy is in my collection. When this came out, I was interested in it, but I didn't purchase it on launch day because I talked myself out of it because I felt like I wouldn't get a ton of use out of this palette. But really, there's quite a few everyday neutrals with just like a few dark, deep blue green shades. Even this like lime green is not an everyday shade, but it's definitely more wearable for me, at least in my opinion, than the three like deeper blue teals. But this palette is absolutely beautiful, and I've had so much fun playing around with this one. This is one that's actually gotten a decent amount of use out of me even this year as well, which is always a good gauge for me. Like if it's gotten use the following year as well, it does mean that I really enjoyed it. And then the ColourPop Cabana Club, I wasn't going to purchase, but I purchased it with the Lush Life palette to get free shipping. And I am so glad that I decided to purchase this because the color story was like something I was interested in but quickly talked myself out of. But owning this in my collection, like these shimmers, so beautiful, so good. And then you have like your mattes, which just work. Like these two mattes, I don't know that I've used more than one time, but the other neutral mattes, like you have just like neutral mattes to like ground or round out this palette. And I loved this one last year. Again, got some good use out of this one this year as well. So really happy about these two ColourPop palette purchases. I forgot to mention this one because I feel like I purchased this towards the beginning of 2021, I believe. It's the Be Perfect Carnival palette. I think this was 2021. I barely used this last year. It's a huge palette. I wanted this to have all the colors in my collection. This is now going in my pan in every palette, so I am trying to get through every single shade within this palette, but I barely used this last year. And truly, this is another one I feel like if I could get my money back for this one, I maybe would return it, just because knowing me and my makeup use and like the colors that I wear day to day, I'm not gonna get a ton of use out of this palette likely in like its lifetime with me. I'm not mad to have this in my collection, but I also don't feel like I needed to purchase this. Sometime last summer, I don't remember when the Nabla Trend Mood box takeover was, but as I mentioned, I did get two of the Nabla Cutie palettes in that box, one of them being the blue palette and then also the analog palette right here, which is a really beautiful, again, warm bronzy brown palette. I love the Nabla formula in that each palette has so many different textures and formulas. It's not just like a matte formula and a metallic formula. You get like a lid topper formula and a true metallic and these cream to powders and mattes, and it's just such a unique palette to my collection. I'm very happy to have this one. Sometime last summer, I also purchased the Viseart Soleil La Plague, I think, unless this is a 2020 purchase, but I feel like this was last year. I could again be wrong about this one, but I gave Viseart another chance. Viseart, I have owned 2 or 3 palettes in the past of varying sizes and just never really been that impressed with the formula, but something about this palette I really loved. I think with Viseart, you have to go in knowing that you're not going to get the most pigmented mattes right away. And really that's what works best for me. And I've learned that over the years. Like, it's nice to have a buildable shade, and it's nice to do looks that aren't super punchy in your face every day. My camera battery died. That's really what I've come to love about this palette. I believe I was saying, just it's a more buildable, like it takes more time to build up the look, or sometimes I can just get like the most easy breezy beautiful look with this, and I am so happy with this. I do want to grab more Viseart palettes, but I'm trying to not spend a lot of money right now. September, another ColourPop purchase. This may be one of my more disappointing ColourPop purchases of last year, maybe because I was super excited about it, but it was the ColourPop Tinkerbell palette. Some of the shades I feel like are pretty unique to my collection, like these greens, these 2 greens specifically, I don't feel like I have elsewhere. I didn't find the quality in this palette to be like the tip-top ColourPop eyeshadow quality that like we've come to know and love. Like, I feel like ColourPop can be super hit or miss, and for me this was more of a miss. Like these two shades I felt like were like really powdery, the like pinky mauves, which would be like my comfort in this palette. I felt like they were really powdery and just like took a lot of building up, but like still you didn't get like the pigment payoff that you would want. So I don't know. I'm not gonna declutter, and actually like looking at this, I'm like, I really do want to do a look like using like these two shades just look so fun, but those are my feelings on that. I totally forgot that the Natasha Denona Retro palette released last year, but I did pick this one up as well. This is a beautiful palette, great Natasha Denona quality. If you like this color story, I would highly recommend this palette. It's been a little bit since I've reached for this, but these are like my tones in like November, December, so I'm very excited to reach back into this, and I'm very glad that I picked this one up last year. I believe these were an August 2021 purchase. I purchased 3 out of the 4 Huda Wild palettes. So I have Huda Wild Tiger, which is my favorite out of the 3, and actually the one that I almost didn't pick up. This is the one we had a casualty in the gold shade, but this shade right here is like my absolute favorite. This is such an awesome palette. Quality is great. Quality with Huda Obsessions palettes can be super hit or miss. Quality throughout all 3 of these actually was really great. I love this because it is a warm palette, but some of these shades are actually pretty unique to my collection. Like I don't feel like I have a yellow or a golden yellow quite like this. And I really have enjoyed the looks that I've created with that palette. For a cool toned option, I have the Huda Jaguar palette. Also a really beautiful palette. Again, pretty unique to my collection with some of the cooler tones, and I just like the overall curation of this palette, so I'm very happy to have this. And then for a little bit more fun, I have the Huda Wild Python palette, and this is another one that like intimidated me when I started to use this to test it out, but I've actually felt really inspired by this palette, and I'm very happy to have this one in my collection. I think this one has a really fun curation of colors as well, and overall I was super impressed with the Wild Obsessions palettes from Huda Beauty. October-ish, we're getting fuzzier and fuzzier as we go along. The Glam Light Chocolate Martini palette, one of my favorite palettes from last year that continues through today. I think this has a lot more depth and variety than it even like comes across on camera, or even some of like the teaser pictures I saw. I was gonna get the Dirty Martini palette, and then I was like, no, get a neutral palette you'll reach for every day. But I didn't feel like I was gonna be super inspired by the color story, but I actually love this. I've created some of my favorite looks from 2021 using this palette, and very happy to have that one in my collection. From Alien Cosmetics, who I believe is Unearthly Cosmetics now, I purchased 2 palettes around September, October of last year. I have the Not Normal palette and the Hauntingly Glamorous, and the biggest reason I purchased both of these palettes was truly for the packaging. I just thought the artwork on both of these were great. I wanted to support and try a different indie brand. This is what the Not Normal palette looks like. Super grungy and kind of reminds me of ABH Subculture. I currently have this pulled to use, and I need to do some more looks with it, but the shimmer metallic shades in here are beautiful. And then I also have the Hauntingly Glamorous palette, which is just absolutely not within my realm of comfort. So I haven't reached for this one that much, and I need to challenge myself to do so. I still don't know that I would ever declutter this palette, just again because I love the packaging, the artwork, and that it's from an indie brand. But that might be one where it's like, if I could get my money back for that one, maybe I would, just because I shouldn't have purchased that one. The Not Normal, I feel like I can get more use out of, and truly this is probably my favorite artwork slash packaging in my entire makeup collection. But those are my thoughts on that. I also picked up the NARS Climax palette. Obviously I was interested in more of the NARS eyeshadow releases, and I will say the Climax palette, I was a little bit less impressed with this formula than the Summer Solstice, and not necessarily the shimmer shades. I love all of the metallics in this palette. They remind me a lot of the MAC holiday eyeshadows that released last year, and I was like wanting every single but talked myself out of purchasing. I love the metallics in this. I think they're so fun, especially for like the cozier time of year, like November, December. But I did find that these 2 deeper mattes specifically were a little bit more difficult to work with, which could just be common with deeper mattes in that realm. But I did purchase this palette, and I purchased a NARS palette after this, so it's not like the quality was like bad in a sense that I didn't want to try NARS anymore. It just wasn't quite as easy to use as the NARS Summer Solstice. In November, I believe, maybe October, maybe November, I purchased the Vive Muse palette. I love Jamie Genevieve and I have been wanting to continually support her brand. I did not purchase her first eyeshadow palette just because it was a neutral brown eyeshadow palette. I felt like many of the colors were overlapping, but I did decide to purchase this one, which is obviously more like mauve-y, pinky, purple toned. And I will say I enjoyed this palette. It's definitely a lot larger than I thought it was going to be. Like, this palette is huge. You have a great mirror. I like the packaging, but I wasn't like blown away by the quality. It's just okay in my opinion, and it is a little bit higher priced. But if she released another palette with a color story I liked, I wouldn't hesitate to purchase it. But I'm like, this is just like, it's not like my favorite palette in my collection, but I'm still happy to have it. One of the palettes that I purchased last year that I absolutely love, again, purchased it during the Sephora VIB sale time, Huda Beauty Rose Quartz. I love this more and more each time I use it, and each time I use it I feel like I go in with like a specific vision in mind for a look I want to create, and I come out with something completely different, but something that I still love and adore so much. So I love this palette. The Huda Empowered palette has released. I'm trying to wait till the VIB sale to purchase it so I can get it at a discount, but I will be purchasing it because I love the Huda palettes she releases every year. Very happy to have that one. If you don't like mauves or purples or pinks, like, this is not going to be the palette for you. But the way that she did, like, she's another one where she will include so many different textures and formulas within her palette. I just think they're so unique, so I absolutely love that. I did purchase the Glam One eyeshadow palette from Lawless during the VIB sale as well. I was not a fan of the One eyeshadow palette from Lawless, but her mini palettes I think are really great quality. I've had nothing but good luck with them. I love the shimmers. They're super intense and metallic, so if you don't like a metallic foiled shimmer, this is not going to be the formula for you. But I also find that her matte formula blends really well, at least the ones in the smaller palettes. Definitely not the larger palette, at least for me. And I love the color story in this. I like that you have like a mauve row as well as like a brown-y row, if you will. Super happy with that. And then the last two palettes, again, I'm not sure when I purchased this one last year, but I purchased the M Cosmetics Divine Rose palette last year because I was super interested in M Cosmetics and I thought that this was a fun color story. I will be honest, I have not reached for this much at all this year. I do like the shimmer shades in here, and the mattes are fine. It's this shade that throws me off. Even though it's like a rosy palette, like, I feel like I could do without this shade. It's just like not a type of shade that I reach for that often. But you can get a complete look out of this palette. It's pretty one-noted, but I've enjoyed it. I'm not going to declutter it. I kind of wish that I hadn't purchased this because shortly after this, or sometime within this year, M Cosmetics has released more like neutral brown palettes, which is, in general, would work more for me day to day, even though I have tons of neutral browns throughout my collection. The final palette that I purchased in 2021 was the Patrick Ta Major Dimension. This is the original, and I'm upset with myself that I waited so long to purchase this. Although I will say, this had been on my radar for months, but it was constantly sold out at Sephora and on the Patrick Ta website. So when I finally was able to scoop it up, I was so happy about it. This palette has gotten a ton of use from me this year. This is one of probably my most used palettes of 2022. I say that now, and like, I'm getting ready to film my least and most used palettes of the year, and this will probably not even be in the top 5. But I love this palette. So easy to use. I did not think I would get any use out of the cream shadows on the end, but I actually, this past summer, loved using those cream shadows for just one shadow and done. It just worked so well. You also have a good variety of textures, specifically in the top row with the metallic shimmer foiled shadows as well. And even though this is like a brown palette, I do feel like there's a lot of versatility and a lot that you can do with this palette. So I'm very happy that I decided and finally was able to purchase the Patrick Ta Major Dimension palette. But after that, I'm completely out of breath. I feel like I need to go to Starbucks and go get like a medicine ball, even though I'm not sick. That just like sounds super delicious right now. But that is gonna wrap it up for today's video. Reflecting on all of my palette purchases from 2021. I'd love to know, how many palettes did you bring into your collection last year? What were your favorites, least favorites? Let's chat about it in the comments below. Other than that, thank you so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting my channel, as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.